target particular countries. And then you can see that, of course, it's well suited to some and not so well to others. So that's another way, you know, what is the cost of the Eurozone is also that some countries have, you know, have the monetary policy not adjusted to them. And that's something that you see here. You see, so that's interesting. You have other countries that are, like Japan, it's another story, but Spain and Portugal are countries that are not, you know, factored in primarily, you know, prominently in the ECB policy. ECB, you know, targets its own 2% average inflation rate. You see, so for example, Germany now is growing very fast. You see, so they say, oh God, there is a danger. They don't take into account the fact that other countries in Southern Europe have problems. You see what I mean? They look at the average. That's problematic. Okay, so now let me show you the second stage regression. So the first type of this result is that I look at the interaction between counter-cyclical monetary policy, counter-cyclical short-term interest rate, and credit constraint, either the asset tangibility or the financial dependence. And you see that it's as before. It's exactly like fiscal. You see, the more credit constrained a sector is, the more growth benefits from a more counter-cyclical fiscal monetary policy. But now the more interesting is to look at the liquidity constraint. So here I'm looking at and the effects are much bigger. So when I look at the inventories to sales ratio and labor cost to sales ratio. And in sectors whose equivalent in the US have higher inventories to sales ratio or higher labor cost to sales ratio, the growth in those sectors in other countries than US benefit much more from a more counter-cyclical real short-term interest rate, you see. The effect is much bigger. So monetary policy particularly is important with regard to liquidity constraint, even more than it is with regard to credit constraint. You see, that's what this regression suggests. So now you can look at other stories. You can control for government size, for inflation, and you get that the effects are robust exactly the way you found the effects were robust for when you are looking at the cyclicality of fiscal policy. And now the magnitude of the effects, or what's very interesting, you can see the effects are much bigger when you look at the interaction with liquidity constraint than they are when you look at the interaction with credit constraint. They are always sizable, but much more important with respect to liquidity constraint. So really counter-cyclical monetary is particularly important for more liquidity constraint sectors. Look, here look at monetary, yeah? And you said now you could have a kind of complementarity between monetary and fiscal because the fiscal could help remove the liquidity problems of sectors. That's what you have in mind there. You said you could use fiscal to, here I look, the liquidity constraint is the sector, you know, structurally is subject to liquidity constraints. You see, I take a sector in Italy, I look at the equivalent in the US, and I say this sector is prone to be liquidity constrained because it has these technological characteristics. So those are things that I'm not supposed to affect through policy. They are supposed to be technological characteristics. The fact of being prone to be liquidity constrained. Yeah. Yeah. Because, and then interest rate go up. But the regression take this into account. In fact, that's the thing. So what's interesting is that these regressions suggest that there might be this crowding out effect, but that they're somehow dominated. Absolutely, they are there. They exist theoretically.
I understand the regression, but how does, in your mind, what is the theoretical mechanism by which a government borrowing more alleviates the credit constraints of private borrowers? How does it work? The government goes in, borrows more.
Because it has the tax. Because the government may have more, if the government is disciplined enough, particularly, and because he can raise taxes, he has something that the firms don't have. That's an idea that Holmstrom and Tirole had also expressed. You see what I mean? In their paper on private versus public provision of liquidity.
So what you have in mind is the government giving loan guarantees to private borrowers, for example? Something like that?
Exactly.
Okay.
You see, they have a fiscal power that allows them to have a credibility that private guys don't have.
Okay.
I think that's implicit in the but that I borrow from Holmstrom, Tirole and other the papers who have, you know, developed on this aspect. And in fact, I incorporate them in a macro growth model. Okay. So now what's interesting is this table. Alors, this table is interesting. This table, there is this asymmetry between upturn and downturn. The effect is much bigger in downturn than in upturn. Exactly like fiscal policy. The growth enhancing effect of monetary counter-cyclicality is bigger in downturn than in upturn. That's already something I wanted, that you also like, Costa. So now the interesting one is this one. That's an intriguing table, and that's my last table. I look at downturn, upturn, and low-tech, high-tech sectors. So if you look at downturn, in downturn, it's good for both low-tech and high-tech sectors to have lower short-term interest rate in downturns. But to have, what I would like is to have higher interest rate in upturns. Why, and if I don't do that, why is it bad? Well, to have higher interest rate in upturns is particularly good, you see, for high-tech sectors, you see? So somehow, this suggests, but I haven't done the theory, that there is a cost not only of not having low interest rate in downturn, but of not having higher interest rate in upturn. And I think the cost is partly a misallocation of funding between low-tech and high-tech. In a sense, in upturn, you would also like to push the high-tech, and you are helping too much the whole low-tech, the real estate and all those guys are helped too much in upturn if you don't have higher interest rate. So that suggests an interesting idea that there is a cost not only to not having a low interest rate in downturn, but also to not having a high one in upturn, because you create misallocations. And that, I think, is an idea that should be pushed. We haven't done anything with it. We have not modeled it, but we think that that suggests interesting avenues for looking at things. Okay? So now that's my concluding slide. My concluding slide is what I said at the beginning. You know, you had Keynes on the one hand, and you have the conservative on the other. And we propose a Schumpeterian view, counter-cyclical macroeconomic policies help financially constrained firms maintain growth-enhancing investment over the business cycle. So you should have counter-cyclical support to innovative investment. In a sense, you should have R&D subsidy or subsidies to training included in what we talk, the automatic stabilizers. Those should be part of the automatic stabilizers. And then I think that this idea can be extended. You know, you have this whole debate on Basel III, on the capital requirements of banks. We know that it's good to ask banks to have more equity. Alors, there are people like Helvig and Admati who say they should have very high capital adequacy ratio. This suggests that those should be cyclical. That means you should be less demanding on banks in big recession and in big expansion in terms of the capital adequacy ratio they have, for very much the same reasons as what I have developed here. The same logic should apply also to support Basel III. In fact, there is no real support for Basel III, and they came in a kind of pragmatic way to the idea that you should have cyclical capital requirement. That might be a way to approach the question. So in fact, what I wanted to push, to finish up on the big thing, why did I do growth the way we did with the Schumpeterian model with Howitt? We wanted to put IO in growth. We wanted to put firms in growth. We want to look at the effect of monetary and fiscal from the point of view of firms. We would like people in central banks to say, well, what does it do to the firm? You see what I mean? And to look at the effect on firms. That's the kind of, and look at the effect of policies this way, taking the point of view of firms and the kind of investment they make and the kind of, and I think that's a kind of important aspect. Another lesson I want to draw from this, Greece, for example, Italy, maybe France now and things, we need to increase fiscal discipline, particularly in order to become more counter-cyclical in the future. The problem is we don't want to kill growth-enhancing investment. So how can we do that? How can we improve our fiscal discipline without killing growth-enhancing investment? My big criticism to Cameron is that Cameron is cutting also on education fees. My big fear with Greece is that you would force Greece to cut on education and growth-enhancing investment. And I think the whole point is to help countries become more disciplined fiscally so that they could be more counter-cyclical, but at the same time without killing exactly what you want to foster with a more counter-cyclical policy, which are investment in education, R&D, training, and lab equipment and these kind of things. And I think that's what a kind of big challenge of macro policy today. You see what I mean? That's what I call Schumpeterian. Before you used to have the Keynesian, which to say support demand everywhere, but we know the multiplier. There have been big debate on the multiplier. Various people say the multiplier is not high, but they didn't look at growth regression. You see what I mean? So I say the short run is not what you should look at. You should have targeted intervention. Target, investment in R&D, target growth enhancing investment, and it's those guys that you should make sure are maintained over the cycle. You see, have a targeted view of macro intervention. It's neither the Keynesian says raise demand everywhere, it's nor the monetarist says lower cut and tax and spending everywhere. It's this targeted macro intervention. And that's, I think, is a new way of thinking about macro policy. That's what I wanted to push. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. Joseph?
I want to ask about the applicability of the results of this paper, because we know that while most developed countries, and you talked about a sample of the OECD countries, so we know that for most developed countries, this is the studies of Gali and others, fiscal policy is indeed counter-cyclical. But we also know by other studies, that's okay, that for other countries, the less developed countries, fiscal policy is mostly pro-cyclical. Yeah, like the paper by Alessina and Tabellini is one of the papers that tries to explain it. And I think that the most common explanation is that this is because the governments themselves are credit constrained in a way. So they find it very hard in bad times to allow themselves to have a deficit. So in that sense, what can we tell them? I mean, these are the countries that really need mostly economic growth. And we tell them, do something that they cannot do anyway. So we should think a bit further of how we can help the poor and less developed countries that are facing huge fluctuations, and just to tell them that they should do counter-cyclical fiscal policy is something that maybe they cannot do.
So the answer to your question, I think, you raise a very good question. I think partly in the Alesina Tabellini, the reason comes from the fact that you have a mixture of democracy and corruption. No? So that's the story. I mean, that's more for developed that you know. Bon. So that's not. So you have also some time where it's a matter of managing. You have kind of institutional reasons, linked to the political system. So, for example, there are some people like Van Hagen, for example, who has tried to look at the way of organizing government or policies. You see what I mean? Can help achieve more counter-cyclical policy. So there is a whole area where already some government you could, much more than what you might think, through, having the agenda discussed differently, or, through organizing power differently, you can, and that's also my political instrument would help actually, could improve counter-cyclicality. So I think one should not underestimate the extent to which you have a margin there. But you're right, you raise a reason. You could say even with this, they might have limited ability to have a counter-cyclical policy. And that would suggest a role for IMF, I think, or for IFIs, to help the countries achieve a bigger counter-cyclicality. And I think that would be, but that was never put in those terms, you see what I mean? So that would be reconsidering the whole role of IFIs to help countries that even are doing all what they could do on the Van Hagen margin, on the Alesina margin, and on the other margin we talked about on inflation and fiscal discipline, that to improve, and still they have the constraint on that, to see whether, you could have further support to that. But I think you said, we looked at various covariates, and we have some views of things that can help improve things. And sometimes, for example, Latin America, there